Yvette Cooper, she has basically said that we've lost respect for the police in this country. And long story short, she's not having any of that. She completely is against that and she wants to turn that whole thing around. Matt Goodwin, your thoughts?
I think it's an interesting intervention by Yvette Cooper, and one thing I don't want to do is rehash the arguments over two-tier policing, because I feel like we've had a week of that. But my personal view is I think there is an issue there that we need to talk about. What I want to say, though, is of all the interventions Yvette Cooper could have made as Home Secretary, it's interesting that she zoomed in on respect for the police, because I think this is what Labour have done. They've turned the issue of the last week or so into a criminality, law and order issue, and there is certainly part of that which is true. But what they've not done is what we saw during Black Lives Matter, which is what Keir Starmer did then, which is say, actually, there are wider grievances and concerns here that we need to talk about. It's not just a law and order criminality issue. There is systemic racism and discrimination. There are issues within the black community that we need to talk about. This time around, it seems Labour are falling over themselves to not talk about those wider grievances. I mean, I've got flack all week on social media for saying this is clearly about the collapse of our borders, mass migration, broken model of multiculturalism, because nobody, it seems, within the Labour movement, except maybe Bill, wants to talk about the wider grievances that many people in this country feel.
Is that fair, Bill?
No, it's not. We've been talking about this right the way throughout the general election campaign, and we'll be talking about it beyond. But what we saw...
You've been talking about what?
About immigration, that it's too high, that it needs to be dramatically reduced, that it's 3 times higher today than it was when the last Labour government left office, that we've got to tackle...
That's a bit misleading, Bill.
That's not a bit misleading.
You guys opened the door to mass immigration.
Sorry, Matthew, net migration is 3 times higher today than it was in 2010, and that's because the Tories completely lost control. So, of course, we need
was it in 97?
Hold on. Of course we need to tackle it, but we need to distinguish that from the lawlessness and the mob rule that we've seen for over almost 2 weeks, which is, frankly, in my experience, some of the worst lawlessness we've seen in this country, in my experience. That had to be tackled. It had to be tackled through clear messaging. It had to be tackled through early court cases coming forward, and that has begun to work. But without that intervention, I think we were losing control of the country.
Just because I sometimes feel like I'm going insane, do you at all see any credence in the argument that Keir Starmer reacted very differently to Black Lives Matter protests in 2020 than he's reacted to these protests in 2024? Or am I sort of making this up? Because I remember Keir Starmer in 2020 saying, there are legitimate grievances here, we need to talk about it, I need to take the knee, I need to intervene. Whereas now, Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper are saying this is criminality, law and order, far-right thuggery, nothing to see here, move on.
Well, no, I actually think there's an absolute consistency with Keir. Go back to the 2011 riots, which were in response to a black person being attacked. Keir absolutely cracked down hard on that. He was at the forefront of talking about law and order through Black Lives Matter. And now it's a consistent theme for him that you have to act fast, you have to act early if you're not to lose control in social terms. And I think that's absolutely the right priority.
One of my viewers, Adrian, he's a GB News member, thank you for that. He says, Michelle, we respect the police. It's the politicians that we've lost respect for not addressing the major problems which affect our country. And you know what? And I hope, I really do hope that this kind of violent episode has stopped. I really hope it has. I want to live in a country where we've got as much harmony as we possibly can. But if you squeeze something and you kind of suppress something, that doesn't mean that you can high-five yourself because the problem has now gone away. Because if people have got issues, just because they're told off and, chastised and that we've created all of these show trials and all the rest of it, it doesn't mean that overnight the problem is solved. And I think people seem to be missing that.
I think the problem is going to get worse. I really do. And I don't want to say that, Michelle, but I really do. Look, we're already running net migration levels at 600,000-700,000 a year. No country, no one's ever done this before and come out on the other side as a healthy, vibrant, cohesive country. The borders, we know, have collapsed. Today, 18,000 illegal migrants have entered the country this year alone. We know, I would argue, that the illegal migration crisis is going to get worse. We can talk all day long about smashing the gangs, but unless we've got a deterrent, unless we leave the ECHR, we can't control our own borders. And the point that I think left and right in some other galaxy would agree on is that the British people deserve to feel safe in their own country. And at the moment, millions of people do not feel safe in their own country, under either the Labour government or the preceding Conservative governments. The elite class generally have failed on all of these issues, and that is why people are so frustrated.
And that was, I think, the point that Adrian's making, that people have almost disconnected, because I think we had one of the lowest turnouts in God knows how many years. I was going to say a century, but I don't know if it was that long. At the last general election, we've got a government elected with about 20% of the national vote collectively, which is not that great. Many of you watching perhaps would have voted for reform. And did you see the protests this weekend? If you didn't see them, luckily for you, I've got some footage of it. Take a look at this. OK, it's coming. Hold that thoughts. But you will have seen some of these scenes. I'll show them to you.
Yeah, I know.
Hold on. Let me respond to Matthew, because, you know, he
hasn't said anything yet.
He said a lot in the previous segment.
Go on,
you know, let me put it another way.
OK.
If Labour hasn't reduced net migration significantly within a few years, we will have failed. And there's an absolute determination to do that by tackling illegal migration, but also tackling legal migration as well. You know, in the last week, Yvette Cooper has charged the Migration Advisory Committee to review the permissible lists of those sectors of the economy that can recruit foreign workers over British workers. And I think that's absolutely the right thing to do. However, Matthew, we're on day 39 of this Labour government, and it is going to take time.
Listen, I hope you're right, but we also know what Labour have done over the last 30-odd days. They've loosened migration from Afghanistan. They've removed the salary threshold, so relatives of migrants will find it easier to come into the country. We've got an illegal migration plan, I would argue, that's not going to work. They've amended the Illegal Migration Act, essentially giving an amnesty to tens of thousands of people, saying to other people around the country...
Getting rid of Bibi's...
Well, hang on a minute.
Loads. There's a list.
There's a list in only 30 days. And to top it all off...
And yet... the projections are that net migration, which was at 685,000, is by next year going to be down to 200,000.
Yeah, OK. So if net legal migration next year falls to 200,000 a year, I will come back on this show and I will eat this lovely cream blazer
I'll hold you to
that I'm wearing. Because the blunt reality, though, is, and it's a serious issue, right? Because what's the number one issue in this country today, according to the polling? According to YouGov's polling, immigration has gone up 10 points. Economy number 2, crime number 3. Immigration is what everybody out there is talking about, except Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper. People out there are saying, can you please lower the levels, get control of the border? I don't want to feel unsafe in my own country. I feel like I'm one of those puppets. I've just been saying this over and over again for the last few weeks.
We have been talking about migration. We will continue to talk about it. More importantly,
Bill,
unlike the last government, we will act on it.
We need to get control. I hope you do. I really do. And as I say, if you do, I will be the first person to come here and say congratulations.
We did it when we were last in power, when we significantly reduced asylum numbers over 5 years, from 2005 to 2010.
That's slightly different. We didn't have mass immigration until we had a Labour government.
Well, we had the expansion of the European Union, and, you know, bluntly, and I think you were in favour of Brexit, but, you know, actually most of those were hard-working people who came here to support our economy.
And the new ones aren't.
Well, I think there is a concern that not everyone who comes here is as hard-working as those East European migrants who came to staff our restaurants, our shops and other businesses.
What we need is a new consensus. We need to freeze all non-essential immigration into this country outside of the NHS and some migration for social care. And we need a freeze so we can absorb the changes that we have experienced over the last 25 years.
Many people will be watching this as well, Bill, and you're talking about immigration, and I know that you're a big fan, for example, of Tony Blair. Many people will be watching this while going, hang on a minute, Michelle. It was some of the foreign policy interventions of the likes of Blair that have now made so many people want to move away from some of those countries And that is what's responsible for a lot of the movement. Also, people will be getting in touch and saying the likes of Rachel Reeves, I think it was back in 2016, she was saying that if we don't get kind of a handle on things like immigration, we will see riots, or she was worried that we would see riots potentially sweeping the streets. So I found it interesting that when she predicted that, there you go, that's the headline there, that riots could sweep the streets of Britain is if immigration is not curbed after Britain. Well, fast forward all these years, immigration wasn't curbed after Britain. People did see those riots, and all of a sudden, they're not the concerned people that Rachel Reeves was referring to in 2016. Now, they're scum of the earth, apparently, awful far-right individuals, these 12-year-olds.
But hold on. What we saw on our streets with people firebombing hotels, throwing bricks at police, storming mosques, that's not British. That's not...
It's horrendous criminality.
Horrendous criminality. And we had to crack down on it rightly.
Are you proud of the fact that you've just... Matt. Are you proud of the fact that a 12-year-old has just been convicted?
I don't know about proud of it, but I think it's the right thing to do. You know, we've just been talking about knife crime. You know, if you're going to tackle knife crime, you have to tell 12, 13, 14-year-olds that there are consequences if they carry knives and use them. And exactly the same prevails when we're talking about riots.
Because I'm very uncomfortable. I completely, criticise, I condemn people taking matters into their own hand by way of violence, whether that's to people, property, places of worship and so on and so forth. But there's just been this strange turn to me that so many people in power seem to be almost gloating. And it's like, look at us clamping down on this 12-year-old. This is a kid that's just left primary school, pretty much. And I find it like the turn of celebrating that actually you're going to batter these kids with criminal records for kicking a window and kicking... I don't know, maybe I'm like... people will be shouting back at the telly saying, Michelle, it's absolutely right. And in another breath, Michelle, you'd be saying tough on crime and law and order and so on. Look, so many people who are frustrated about immigration, they did turn to reform, about 4 million of them. I've just been showing you on the screen, perhaps we'll get it up again. People now went down to what they thought was the head office of Reform UK to declare, essentially, that this party is fascist, Nazi scum, basically. What do you think to that?
I think it's utterly ridiculous. I think those people are idiots. I think essentially what they're trying to do is what people on the left often try and do during moments of crisis, is shut down debate, narrow the public square. The Reform Party is a democratically elected party with 5 MPs in the House of Commons. Nigel Farage is a Democratic Member of Parliament. But what we're seeing is the same thing that we saw in the aftermath of Brexit, an attempt to shut down a debate that people on the left don't really like. It's an attempt to find a bogeyman. It's Vladimir Putin, it's Dominic Cummings, it's Nigel Farage, it's Tommy Robinson. You know, a lot of those figures, by the way, like Reform, they wouldn't actually be in our national political life had the elite class in this country actually controlled migration. I find it bizarre that the people who are going to the Reform headquarters are often the same people shouting at me on Twitter and X for calling out mass immigration. The reality is Nigel Farage did not cause the riots and the protests. Mass immigration caused the riots and the protests. A sense of not being safe in the country caused the riots and the protests. So if you don't want Nigel Farage in British politics, why don't you deal with mass immigration and the collapse of our borders?
Nigel Farage was not responsible for it, but I think some of the things he said, for example, what are we not being told, were extremely dangerous and ill-judged, and I think he needs to think about that. Do you think then that Nick Lowell's, the head of Hope Not Hate, should also be dealt with for spreading misinformation about people throwing acid at Muslim people? Yes. Yeah,
right. I haven't seen any. That's great, Bill. I wish you were in the Labour cabinet because I haven't seen any frontline Labour politicians.
Hold on, Matthew. Across the board. However, something I learned as a minister working on the prevent strategy is there is only one dividing line you can have in terms of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, and that's violence and the advocacy of violence. So I might disagree with people protesting outside Reform's headquarters, but unless they're committing acts of violence, I don't think you can do anything about it.
So, Bill, that's really interesting. So in which case, you would strongly disagree with the Labour government's push to ban legal but harmful content on social media?
We'll come on to discuss that. I've got question marks against it, and I actually think by the time we get to detailed legislation, that won't see the light of day.
There you go. He's teed up the next thing perfectly for me.